specifically damage in games and the mechanical way it's implemented. We'll talk a bit about it. Who am I? I'm Cal Devissa. I'm a game designer. I've worked on a bunch of stuff. Currently working for a company called Digital Confectioners down in Christchurch. I spent about 9 years of my life working on Path of Exile. Also spent a couple of years working on Fortnite through Digital Confectioners on Fortnite Creative, where it was making the tools for other people to make games, and that was very interesting. I also do board game design. My most recent game out with co-designer Jarrett, who's over at the back, Endeavour Deep Sea, being in a retail shop soon, so if you see it, you should buy it. It's very good. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover the early history of damage, hit points. Hit points is kind of where we finish the history of damage, and we're going to discuss damage in general from that point. Briefly going to discuss why hit points 1 is a sort of model of damage, other experiments with damage. Then we're going to discuss why damage matters so much, and then we're going to briefly talk about game feel, and then run back to mechanics and implementation. We're going to talk about granularity of health and damage, and that one called the damage pipeline. There'll actually be a huge chunk of slides there, and we'll discuss, sort of what damage looks like from beginning to end in a game. We'll discuss what happens when you run out of hit points and death, and why it matters, and then we'll allow some time for comments and questions at the end. So, damage. In the beginning, damage in games was represented by pieces. When they were dead, you remove them. Very simple model. They're sort of existential abstracts, so basically a piece has one life, and when the piece is gone, it's dead. Pieces got removed. Most games, for most of history, didn't have damage. The ones the nobility played often had damage. People from warrior cultures, most games are actually nice fortune-telling devices, or you move pieces around, or you get territory. Damage, however, for most of the tech we had, was the piece comes off the board. When we start sort of seeing something other than that is in sort of the 18th, 19th century, 19th century mostly, where we start getting Kriegspiel, where you start getting sort of big professional war games from big professional armies, where they want something that sort of represents battlefield more. And here, it's still kind of the concept of, well, you die, but units, thousands of people fighting, they needed some sort of sense of proportionality. So you start to get sort of dice being used to see what you lose, and then some way to represent the sort of loss of those units on a board. So they often use blocks which they turned, or have little toy soldiers that they removed. This turned into miniatures wargaming, which uses exactly the same model. You take the pieces off. And then the first big sort of technology boost to damage tracking is counters. You turn them over when they've taken some damage. Initially it was replace the counter with another one, because printing on two sides of paper is difficult, but as soon as you can print stuff on two sides and line it up, you've got damage. You can turn a counter over and show how you've lost some damage. Then, we're running through this history fast, we get to Dungeons and Dragons. This came straight out of wargaming, and it's where we start to sort of first see hit points. When you score a hit on something, you can roll the dice, tells you how much damage you've done, and you've taken away from something. This started off basically a Cambrian explosion of this kind of game. Dungeons and Dragons was sort of hugely influential. There was a ton of role-playing games and very early computer games. Computer games following this model came up very fast, straight onto university mainframes. Rogue, where we get roguelike from, classic example. Play it on your mainframe, you go send your little guy in, all the monsters have damage, they get sort of lose it over time. The features of this are, and they sort of remain to this day, two numbers. You have a maximum where your hit points can be, or where they start, and a tracked current value. Tracked value goes down, damage is applied to your hit points, bad things happen when you hit zero. As I said, it spreads to other paper role-playing games, to computer role-playing games, and to other games. And in fact, you can find damage following this model in the weirdest places. Current example, this game called Love Nicky. You play dress-ups, you put dresses on your dolls, you go do fashion comparisons, and then you do hit point damage to other people until you win. And that's very weird if you think about it, but it's because damage is so ubiquitous that even in a fashion game where you wouldn't necessarily follow that model has it. Not all fashion games have that, but that one in particular has this extremely, I know that model, that is damage you're doing to the other girls. So yeah, it's really ubiquitous. And in computer games, unlike other games, most games are about hurting things. So in computers, it's a little less true now, but mostly you're hurting things, whereas in other sort of forms of games, that's still kind of a weird niche and a bit odd. After hit points, there's still experimentation. I've said it was a big deal, but people try all sorts of things. Hit locations, individual wound tracking, criticals, bleeding. On this slide, on the right, this sort of Interceptor is a space fighter game, and that's the damage sheet. If you get hit, you take armor damage based on the shape of the thing that hits you, and you draw out your little grids, and then it hits a component in your ship based on where you've been hit, and you follow the damage thing, and your damage computer control tries to fix it again. It's really complicated, and it's the kind of thing that was happening. Hit points, though, return again and again. Sometimes there's other systems of damage as well, but hit points really does seem to keep winning the fight every time, which is odd. It's not a good simulation of damage, you would think. Why? It's an interesting question. It's logistically easier, and that's only part of the answer. The other reason is it's a better metaphor. So, we're going to sort of talk about Lakoff and Johnson, who were the first cognitive linguistics researchers, and basically there's this whole concept of embodied metaphor. People in AI at the moment care about it a lot. Why does this matter? So they basically wrote this book called Metaphors We Live By. And this book is an entire book of examples of every part of language basically being a metaphor based on an embodied experience. And as part of that, there are metaphors you wouldn't expect until they point it out to you, and then you go, literally, this is everything. An example is good is up. This is across many different languages, good is up. It is in the upwards direction, bad is down. Health is also up. Health is also a liquid. You have it, you lose it, it runs out. When it's all gone, bad things happen. So while this is not really what happens to your body when you take damage or get sick, this is pretty much how all our language is programmed to talk about health. Hit points work because it is the metaphor we use. And in games, and this is a lesson I've learned hard and I've been on the wrong side of many times, simulation always loses to metaphor. Every time someone tries to show you something and says, this is better because it's more realistic, remember this, it's probably wrong. I do recommend tracking down stuff about cognitive linguistics. If you do, I recommend the book Philosophy in the Flesh, which is what they did after they wrote multiple books about, hey, there's this thing and it's really weird and it's in language all the time. And they started to talk about the whys and wherefores. None of my reading of the stuff has been wasted for game design. Some of the best non-game design books I've read for game design, useful again and again. You might be wondering, well, what about other things? Why is health different? Why is health special? And as in another aside, we're going to talk about death and memento mori. So that little picture over there is a Roman mosaic, and it has one job, and it's to tell you you're going to die. There's a little sort of thing representing the Wheel of Fortune at the bottom, and that's telling you, you don't know when it's going to happen. It also kind of shows the sort of link between death and randomness and death in games. But basically, a lot of pieces of art, their sole job is to tell you, remember you're going to die. Don't forget to live, but you're going to die. And games are emotional experiences. They're art. That goes without saying. And games with death and damage are memento mori machines. They're machines that get to do the memento mori thing again and again and again, thousands of times sometimes, maybe millions. So if you're implementing a game with damage in it, you need to be supporting that emotional experience. You've got to take that serious. You are not just making something that's fun. You are dealing with someone's mythic experience of the world. Your players do not take damage lightly. That's why they're so angry on the internet. So you shouldn't take it. You should take it fairly seriously when you also deal with damage. So damage, hit points, good metaphor for health. Health is a liquid. We talk about it like that. Death matters. That's why it sort of matters than other things that you might track as numbers. We're going to do a brief aside now that I've mentioned emotion about game feel, because that's not what this talk is about, but it's hard to not mention when we're talking about damage. A large part of the experience of damage is game feel. We're going to talk about mechanics, but I kind of need to not ignore this. There are lots of ways to make people feel damage sort of viscerally. Hit effects, UI effects, flinching, loss of control, darkening coming on the screens, all sorts of things. And they're all really important and your game should have them. Imagine there's another entire separate talk you've just seen where someone spent 50 minutes talking about this, and it would be a great companion talk to this one. There's lots of places to look up stuff about game feel. That's a good book. There are other ones as well. Now, mechanics and programming, unfortunately, are very closely linked. Well, not unfortunately, but that's kind of a joke for the programmers out there. Implementing damage in your game is not so easily put aside. How it's implemented really, really matters. For a designer, if you're not a programmer as well, you need to discuss this with the programmers in your life. There's a lot of things that matter. Quick sample of things. Integers versus floats. I generally fall on the side that damage should be an integer. It doesn't have to be, but programmers tend to love floats. Something about linear algebra and that they're really bad at integer math, so don't trust your programmers with integer math. It's true. Just ask a programmer. Why integers? Well, if you're displaying the number, if it's not an integer, it's going to do weird shit all the time while you're not looking. If you've ever seen a game tell you have 0 health and you haven't died yet, it's because of some rounding bullshit. And it's really handy if it's an integer. Now, this can't always be true. Sometimes it needs to be a float. And if you don't show the actual number, it can afford to be a float. And if you're doing damage over a time, you probably want that to be a float and then turn it into an integer when it matters. Where the damage happens matter, and we'll cover this again in later slides, but programming is a very sort of modular, object, fancy thing where things aren't known at different places in your programming code, and where your damage happens really matters. Classic crash when you're making a game is you do some damage and the game explodes because the thing that did the damage is dead and been deleted and is no longer there. Where the damage happens and where the information about it is recorded really matters. Cost of your calculations matter. I'm a game designer. I love exponents. Your computers do not love exponents, particularly when you're doing a lot of damage a lot of times. Well, they can handle them, but be aware of the cost of calculation. The network model happens. Damage does not happen in the order you think. You can't rely on anything happening exactly where and how you expect it. What the player sees in a network model is not what's happening yet. This has a huge effect on your damage model. Video games allow for more complex formula than non-video games. Also consider if you want your players to understand them. If the player doesn't understand the formula, that might be fine, but your player needs to understand what's happening to their character or their vehicle or their empire or whatever it is. So they need to have at least some understanding of what's going on. So, aside from the implementation, which we'll mention again and again as we go, what are some other things that matter about damage? How much health and how much damage? Now this is where, for every slide from here, I'm going to say it depends. How granular does health need to be? I mean, the classic sort of designer, statement in these things is it should be as small, as simple as it can be, but has to be at least as complex as it needs to be. So health can be small as a value, but lots of things can force it to be larger. How quickly does something die when you hit it? Do you have to hit it a lot of times? You're going to need more health, you're going to need variance in damage. Does the damage change? There's lots of other things that affect this. Does it look big? It probably needs more health. This bit of concept art looks big to me, probably needs a lot of health. It has big weapons, probably needs a lot of, to do a lot of damage. Another big thing is progression systems. As soon as you have a progression system, your numbers need to get bigger. If they're going to get bigger, then you're going to need lots of potential for lots of health and lots of damage, because once you hit sort of level 100 of a role-playing game, you're going to need a load of health if you've added, 4% improvement for the last 99 levels. It means you can start small, maybe 10 hit points. You start improving that over multiple levels and you end up with some very large numbers. It can be cultural. Some games need bigger numbers because that's what you get in that genre. If you're making a Pokemon game, there'll be some bigger numbers than you expect that it would need. Sometimes in those games, they just have 3 zeros at the end, and that's fine. Sometimes they need the huge whole number because that's what you expect. So, let's talk about actually hitting things in game and doing them some damage. I could do an entire talk about hitting things, kind of like this talk, but it's about to hit. That would be 50 minutes. Imagine that talk. You've got 3 talks for free now. But it does, hitting matters for damage as it affects how much damage a target takes. As part of the mitigation system, being hit is part of that mitigation. So it's not just armour, it's like if I evade a hit and don't get hit, that is part of your damage calculation, because if I hit you 10 times and 9 times I don't hit you, that's effectively changes your damage versus health calculation. What is your game about? This can matter as a lot for the hit chance. So imagine a game where you're a sniper and you line your shot up and you take your shot. Now this has an effect on how complex your damage can be. For a sniper game, it could be very simple. It could be you hit them in the head and they die. Or it could be incredibly complicated. You hit them in the clavicle and it damages some muscles and then they bleed out and it affects how long they live while people are running in to save them. You can do that in a sniper game. And you can do the other thing where they just die. However, if you're doing a brawling game, you can't actually do either of those things. You have to do something in between. So the way you hit things also affects how you do damage. There is a trend in games towards always hits. And by always hits, I mean there's not a calculated chance you hit, which is not quite the same thing. Basically, as animation technology's gotten better, as we've got better at presenting things, if you see yourself hitting something, you should do it damage. In Morrowind, for example, game from way back, wasn't the case. You see yourself hitting something, you may have hit it 10% of the time. You missed the bat. That's not from Morrowind, that's from something older. But there is a trend towards if you see it hit, it should hit. And then the to hit becomes all about the animations and the player control, which is wonderful, except if you're working out how much damage does something do, because it's suddenly got a lot harder, because then you can't look at your calculations and goes, oh, they hit 20% of the time. You have to go, how often do they hit? How much should they be rewarded for it with damage to the enemy? When the player is hit, how often do they avoid it? That comes down to player skill and the animations and a lot of other things, and you have to be very mindful of that. And before you can work that out, someone's probably wants you to stick some damage calculations into your system. So you're going to be playing around with your damage and how you hit things for a long time. But be mindful of that. How often you hit something matters. And for modern games, which kind of have an always hit mentality, you don't actually know how often that is. Mitigating. Well, actually, before we get to mitigating your damage, we did miss something. You mentioned we've got to it matters where the damage is. Let's look at this other thing. In general, you want your damage to be an independent thing you can track from an attacker to a defender, so that you can track what's happening to it. And it matters for more than just the modifiers, but the attacker modifiers sort of need to exist on the attacker. The damage needs to sort of exist independently in some form, maybe be modified by an environment, get to a defender, have additional things done to it, and then affect the actor that is the defender. So, mitigation generally happens on the target, but it could happen anywhere in that thing, anywhere in that sort of pipeline, and when and where the damage changes matters. Again, this is a thing you need to discuss with your programmers. I'll say that again a few more times in the talk. Mitigation has words like absorption, armour, block, defence, reduction, resilience, resistance. These words mean nothing, or rather they mean loads of things to every different game designer, because every different game designer, of course, knows better than all the other ones, and we don't want our games to all be the same. So games are really inconsistent about the name and effects, but generally mitigation comes in three main forms, aside from the do hurt stuff, which we've already done. Flat mitigation, you have some damage and you take a number off. Percent reduction, you have some damage, you have a percentage, you take that percentage of the damage away. Rating, you have some sort of formula where you have some sort of rating, and you have a formula which kind of has something about damage over the rating. Let's look at some examples of that. This is the League of Legends formula for all their damage mitigation. All their damage mitigation works the same way and is really nice and elegant. Works really well for League of Legends. Here you have the mitigated damage basically having a formula with damage and defense. Your defense works out really nicely to give you effective hit points. If you have a 25 rating, you effectively have 25% more hit points when you apply this formula iteratively over multiple hits. And this is true for all their systems. It's a nice formula. I would use it if you don't have levels and you don't have that progression problem, or you only have a few levels and then it's fine. It's good. It works in a lot of games. It shouldn't be ignored. It's elegant. It's also not originally from League of Legends, but they're very diligent about pretty much only using that one, mostly. This is Pokemon Generation 1. Pokemon gets way more complicated than that. We generally think of Pokemon as a simple game. It's not. Mostly I have this formula here to show you. A over D. That's the thing we talked about, that all the damage rating formulas have. Here it is hidden in this damage formula. Path of Exile, this one's here because I worked on this one in particular. Here's an armour calculation. You'll notice here this is the other way up, that the damage is under the armour, but you can re-express it with the damage over the attack over the defence basically. On the left is what it originally was in 0.93 when we changed to this form of armour mitigation in Path of Exile. On the right is what's currently on the wiki. So I assume that's sort of accurate for the moment, or at least sometime in the last year. Why this formula? The damage at the bottom is basically to do one thing, so that armour always has something resembling like a flat effect, and then as you do more damage it sort of reduces the effect of armour, and more importantly allows you to have an armour rating on an item that does something meaningfully when the number is small at the beginning of the game when damage and hit points is low, and does something meaningful when all those numbers are now huge. I wouldn't do it this way today. I would probably just say let's have two formulas, a flat reduction and a more understandable reduction. But that being said, having a formula with really complicated consequences works really well for Path of Exile. It's kind of a feature of it. But again, if I was making it today, I'd be making something else. So I wouldn't do it today, but this is one of those bits of work I did way back before 1.0 of Path of Exile. That's still there, where most everything else has been sort of unbolted and replaced with something. The sort of the hit and the damage, that has pretty much carried on with a few minor changes. So normally we don't just have a few types of mitigation, we have many, many types of mitigation. It's often used for different types of damage, often complex. Other game systems interact with it. You have items, you have abilities, you have many things that interact with your damage and your mitigation. Why would we want it to be complex? Often in even simple games, the damage formulas are complicated, and all the systems that integrate it with it are complicated. This sounds like a bad thing, but it's really cheap complexity. What I mean by cheap is you don't need to get an artist working on this 6 months in advance. Your programmers probably just need to repurpose some existing code. You can change stuff really quickly, and you might want it to be complex for a variety of reasons. An example of this, David Heron is a game consultant, works with a lot of companies, and he's on a podcast called the Game Design Roundtable. And one of these, I couldn't find the episode number, otherwise it would be there, he was talking about when you go to a mobile company and they want more monetization, as they always do, you look at the game and go, the game is too simple to bolt anything on that's sort of meaningfully to the gameplay. But if the damage was more complicated, or the combat loop was more complicated, then we can do a lot with that. And it's not just monetization he was talking about, he was actually just talking about if you want to add something to a game or allow systems to interact with it, like increase your items and stuff, if you're doing item design, you've probably at some point gone, I need stats, I need interesting things to put on these items. If you've got a complex mitigation system for your damage, this gives you a hook to go into. And you can have other things leap off of this. You can have something like a berserker that when they take that damage, it activates an ability. So it's not even just mitigation, it's other mechanics you get to attach to it. Flavors of damage allow for some of this. You just sort of say, damage comes in many shapes and forms. They're all hit points, but there's type. That image is the types of damage you get in Warframe, which I have nothing to do with, except I've met the guys, they're very nice, and it's a cool game that's been going on for a while. They have so many damage types. I would never have that many damage types in a game. They have so many and they all interact with each other. It allows for some really crazy things to happen. There's many ways to implement having flavors of damage. I'm briefly going to mention Unreal and tags. I like my damage to come with tags attached to them. In Unreal, which I mostly work with, hidden in the game playability system, there is a tag system that just works. And why it's not in the main engine, I don't know. You don't have to teach someone exactly how you want tags to work. They work like tags in Magic the Gathering or whatever game you want, and it's just hidden there somewhere deep within the engine. And then you can say, this number comes with these tags, and they do stuff. Document and test. Do not document, put it out to people and expect it to work how you expect. It won't. You need to test it. Don't tell people how you want it to work and then test it. You'll be very disappointed. Document and test if you're doing damage with any level of complexity, particularly if you're not the one implementing it, which more and more is the case as sort of studios get bigger. Damage types also allow for more than just flavors of mitigation, because it was never just hit points. We always wanted those experiments back. Status effects. Cold damage can freeze you. Fire damage, of course, does flames. Poison does this. We can have ailments, critical hits, damage over time. Explicit wounds. You can easily do that these days just with a tag. You can say, this damage came with a wound. We'll record that wound. You can have parallel damage types. I can't not mention poise, because if I don't, someone else will. Poise is basically a parallel damage system. You lose some hit points, and when you've lost them, a bad thing happens. And it works entirely in parallel, and you often have weapons that do poise damage, and they do hit point damage. It's basically damage, but a different type that's operating in parallel, and you get to do interesting things like this weapon does so much poise, but not much damage, and then you stun them and do stuff. And this entire genre is based on pretty much that word and the word stamina. Special counters. You can say, you take 10 poison damage, you die. Looking at you, Magic the Gathering. But special counters are used a lot. Damage locations. Crept their way back in, at least since Fallout, probably way before. So hit points won, but one of the reasons they won is it's a very friendly mechanic you can bolt everything back onto again. And now we're dead because we've run out of hit points. Oh, except you haven't, because no one dies when you run out of hit points these days. What are the things that can happen? There is a load of them. On the right here is a list of options on the Creative Fortnite DBNO device. And I put this here because I worked on it. It's always fun to put something you worked on here. This is the public settings, the ones that made it live, and DBNO stands for down but not out. Because when you run out of hit points in Fortnite, you go into a down but not out mode. Oh, I've only got a few minutes left. Cool. Only gives you a few minutes left, and, when you run out of hit points, you go in a down but not mode, which is perfect for a battle royale or the Fortnite that existed before the battle royale, but not much useful for other game modes. So, how do we keep people make other game modes? It's changed a bit since, but the DB&O device allowed people to change the rules. It includes all sorts of things, such as time to revive. Can you be revived? Can you be picked up while you're downed? Is your location known? And there were so many other things that didn't make the cut for the first version of this device. You can do a lot of things when you run out of hit points. Important things to consider. Is there respawning? Time to recover? Do you have a new type of hit point? Fortnite has tenacity. I don't know if it's ever called that publicly, but there's this number. You run out of hit points, you've got another number, and it goes down until you die. And when your tenacity's back, you then get some hit points and you come back up. Lots of battle royales have a model that's similar. Or do you have negative hit points? Or do you do something else? Another popular one is you go into a ghost mode and you fly around and you find your way back, very popular MMO thing. So basically there are a load of things you can do here. Respawning. Now, again, this is it depends on your game. How long does it matter for? Yeah, we'll better rush through this. Recovery and healing. Again, it depends. How long does the damage last for? If it's only a few seconds, the game you are building is about encounters. Lots of games do this. You take some damage, you're out of combat for 5 seconds, all your health comes back. Because hit points don't matter except when you're in combat. If your hit points last a whole session of gameplay and they trickle down, your game is about attrition. Even if you don't want it to be. Many D&D game masters have learned this lesson. If you're using that set of mechanics, your game is about attrition, whether you want it to be or not. It's easy to get around, but it comes as a shock to some people. If you never recover, your hit points are a timer. The game's usually about making multiple runs, or just one, maybe. Again, recovery and healing, you'll have lots of systems for it, integrates with other systems. Abilities, items, objects in the environment, healers and mechanics. So I think what we've covered so far says damage is interesting, it can do a lot of things in a game, it has an excuse to be complex. However, when you do run out of hit points, you are dead. Well, DB&O, then maybe dead later. So back to the other slide. That other slide I had about the Memento Mori was here. And then I showed this talk to someone, they said, you should put that right at the beginning so people know what you're talking about. But be mindful about what you're working on. Think about it. That doesn't just go for damage, but in damage it's especially so. At Digital Confections, we are hiring. We want VFX people and sysadmins and animators and 3D artists and experienced and talented people. Because at Digital Confections we do not have many people. So we tend to want people who are intermediate or senior, except at the moment in animation and 3D, we really just need people. So if you're in those things and you're really good, but maybe not intermediate or senior, do send a message to jobs@digitalconfections.com. Again, I'm Carl DeVissa, I'm a game designer. That's my email. If you're interested in the jobs, that diving helmets from Endeavour Deep Sea. A really good board game which has no damage in it. And then there was a comments and questions. Yes. I welcome comments as well as questions because that's what people want to do. Apparently we've got 10 minutes. We have loads of time for comments and questions. Over here.
Path of Exile, the words increase and more in the passive tree. Do you remember this?
Yes, I'm familiar with them.
Yeah.
For other people,
how much time went into attempting to communicate what those mean to the players?
So in Path of Exile, increased means additive onto an attribute, and more means it's multiplicative. So if you have 10% of this and 10% of this and 10% of this and they're all increased, that's 30%. Whereas if you have 10% more and 10% more and 10% more, that's more than 30% because you do it each time. in the game, early on, it wasn't communicated at all. And in fact, early on in Path of Exile, pretty much the only effort put into describing things was having very consistent text and very consistently laid out and templated text, which is great and you should do it, but it's not enough. I don't remember exactly where increased and more came from. It might have been a programmer who at GGG was known as Mark 1, but it might have even predated that and been a Chris thing, I'm not sure. Now I'm sure at least somewhere in the game it communicates the difference between them, probably in the old show me advanced information. But that's a game which has lots of different ways to add things in. That's why it's got sort of 2 ways to express that, as well as plus. Plus, that's different again. That's just adding the raw number onto another raw number. Who was next? Hello.
As you were going through the different formulas that you put down in, something that I struggle with is if you were to say, okay, I've used one formula, let's try a different one. How do you see the difference when you test the game yourself? I find it really hard to identify what's different about certain things when it comes to actually playing the game.
Right. I like having some sort of program which can display graphs. There's a good one online. Wolfram Alpha does it really well. You put in a formula, it shows you the graph. And then the next trick you need is, how do I turn this curve into the curve I want? And that is, you either do it a lot and learn it intuitively, or better yet, you'd learn a whole bunch of calculus, and then you start to get a feel for what does it. Because I work in Unreal now, I've got super lazy because it's got a curve management system, and you draw your curve and then go make that work, and then I want it to be this different curve, and then you draw that curve and it just does it. And that's really handy, and it means any calculus I've learned along the way I've pretty much lost. But yeah, so having a way to map the curve is useful. And it's a useful skill to be able to go, I want it to be this curve instead of this curve. What is the translation between this curve and that curve? Ask programmers who've done maths and tell them it's calculus and not linear algebra, and you'll be fine as well. Are there any more questions? Hello.
How hard was it to go from game design on the computer to a board game design? Was that a transition become easy, or?
So I went the other way, and tomorrow there's a talk about board game design and computer game design. It's a panel with a bunch of people on it, including people who've gone in both directions, so you should go to that panel. For me, I've kind of always argued design is design. There are things that isn't true for, and that's mostly due to the game loop in a computer is super, super fast. However, there are things people who've learned to make computer games and haven't done other design kind of don't notice if they do learn it fast, because stuff crashes and burns without it. Like a key one being, do your whole loop as fast as possible and do your game loop. A popular mistake if you start in computer games is to make your game and make your game and make your game and never actually close off that loop and see the sort of iteration of your game going through. So yeah, I went from board game design to computer design. I'd done computer stuff in my other career while I was doing board game design, but I'm not a programmer, although I can kind of read code, and I've merged code and done producer stuff with it. And I've learned to do integer math in C++, because programmers don't know how to. That's not true of all programmers, but it's amazing how often people make mistakes with integer math in C++. Hello.
How much do you consider a player's skill evolving when you're building a damage system? As they get better and better, how does that affect the damage?
So I kind of touched on that with the always hit thing, where player skill can matter a lot. Again, this is a it depends thing, and I generally think of it from the other way, is in this game, how much does skill matter? and does that affect the damage? And that can matter a lot. If you have a player who's very skillful, able to output a ton of damage, but your average player is doing 1/10 of the damage, and that suddenly makes things very hard. And in that case, really what you want to do is say, the reward for being really skillful is to do a bit more and not 10 times more. Unless the point of your game is to express skill differences. Because the person who puts all that effort in or has that natural talent doesn't need much reward to be shown appreciation for it, and a tiny bit more damage will have an effect in the game and will also mean the person with less skill is not having that bad of a time. So really the design challenge, I think, in that case is to compress the damage bonuses from skill. In general, people like to make games where skill matters, particularly if they've come up as computer gamers or board gamers where it's usually a different skill, but we like to make games where skill expression matters, so it is something you have to account for when doing damage. Hello.
In terms of game elements, like when introducing new elements into like a pre-existing game, like a new item or new character, how would you consider game elements and like the damage, the pre-existing damage system? Like obviously with power creep and having the new character do more damage is more attractive to audiences. How do you make that like transition, like make it balanced so it's not entirely like one side that people have been using the other?
Right, okay, so the mistake, and this is about how do you balance introducing new damage into, new things that do damage into an existing game. The mistake is to look at your average damage output and make it fit the curve that was originally designed. And the reason this is a mistake is because the game that's actually played is played with the best stuff, which means there's been a new balance curve created outside of the will of designer. You need to look at the game that's actually played and make anything new fit that curve, which then looks like you're kind of pushing power creep, but really you're sort of identifying the power creep that's already happened and fitting to it. Again, you also need to test. The more complex your damage systems, the more risk you've put yourself at that something does something crazy that you didn't expect. So that needs a lot of testing. You also want it to be noticed, and that's a real type thing. When you do new content, it's kind of a marketing push as well. You want people to like the new stuff. So you need it to kind of be exciting to use, which means it needs to do kind of more damage. But then if everything does more damage, then people only play with the new stuff. And the new stuff's only new for a tiny period of time. So you need it to sort of respect the stuff that's already used rather than exists in the game and still be exciting to use, which is a new damage type or a new effect might be better than just sort of upping that sort of raw damage, because that way massive power creep lies. 1 minute. So are there any, oh, yes?
A lot of board games use sort of a push or luck mechanic with some dice or like damage wheels and like hidden components that may reveal how much damage they're going to wage or on, I guess. Is there a particular reason why video games aren't using those kinds of design patterns?
So I think part of it is a video game usually doesn't need to make the excitement in the mechanics. It's got other things going on. And also expressing stuff in a video game is actually in many ways harder than a board game. Board game has all this physical tactility in a sort of 3D environment, and by learning the game you are learning the mechanics, and the player is making the mechanics happen. Which I think allows you to experiment with that more. As well, board games aren't as mass market as video games, and you get to experiment more with them. Maybe this will change, but in practice there are fewer people playing board games. Also, board game designers like to do cool shit. Video game designers obviously like to do cool shit too, but there's other people involved in the discussion as well. So that was 1 minute and no one else has their hand up. So thank you very much for coming to this talk. There were so many good talks in the slot. There was a great Valheim talk, which I wanted to go to. So thanks for coming to this one.